As the regular litany of terrorism rushes us from one outrage to another, the pace of events often leaves behind those people whose lives have been changed by injury, by the loss of a loved one, sometimes simply by the pressure of keeping on living. The first anniversary of the IRA attack on the Remembrance Day service has just passed. So with the glare of publicity now dimmed, this is an appropriate moment to consider some of the long-term implications for those who were scarred, mentally or physically, but who survived.
I had to visit all those who were bereaved and all those who were injured. There were 131 people altogether. And that I did in a period of about 4 months, from the end of January until the end of June.
Now, what sort of strains and stresses did you detect amongst those people?
Oh, very severe stresses in some instances. People felt very, very devastated. They found great difficulty, in fact, in talking about it at times. Felt very much so, and understandably so, that this was the end of the world. Why should it happen to me? Why should it have been my parents? Why should it have been my loved one? Very difficult to understand what really a person feels inside. You can't really be inside, if you like, with the person. But yes, I would say that it's a front. Some people are still very, very low, still very, very hurt.
Do people cover up the depth of their real feelings?
They do. Denial of feeling is a well-recognised psychological way of coping with horror or with death or with bereavement. And we've certainly noticed over the years of the Troubles that people tend to deny either physically, on and off, or as a fixed reaction. I certainly saw this when I looked at some 40 victims of the Enniskillen disaster. We found that people there, and we looked at them 6 months following the tragedy, were reluctant to complain, were reluctant to say, I feel depressed, I feel angry, I'm having strange dreams or nightmares. We literally had to drag the information from them. And I think that's a common psychological finding, but I think in Enniskillen's case, there was an added reason. I think people were reluctant to confess to having bad feelings, anxiety, fear, grief, because the common perception of the Enniskillen population was that they were forgiving and loving and were recovering and were coping, when in truth, a lot of the victims weren't coping, but they felt they shouldn't complain, they shouldn't wear their feelings on the sleeve, as we say.
Many of those concealed feelings emerged as various support groups got to work.
The Enniskillen Appeal Fund was something which again represented a concern within the community. That appeal fund has been of tremendous help to many of the people who were directly affected in the bombing. We have already paid out about £70,000. We have we had a social worker seconded from the Western Health and Social Services Board who visited everyone who was in any way involved, and we have attempted to respond. Indeed, we have responded in every single case in trying to alleviate suffering. Now, I'm not talking about compensation. I think that's another matter. That's outside our scope. What we were concerned about was that we should try and respond as a community in a practical way to help the level of suffering with people. I could point to organisations like Enniskillen Together, where they have quite specific projects in relation to cross-community operation. I think I could point to the way in which we have tried to commence an Enniskillen Community Trust that has evolved out of the Enniskillen Appeal Fund, and the trustees of that are 7 Catholics and 7 Protestants. I think that you look at things like, for example, the Spirit of Enniskillen bursaries. But over and above that then, I mean, I think that many of us involved in the community, we've tried to produce those things that would be hopeful in terms of looking forward to a better quality life in the area.
A range of response at community level certainly helps, but the individual hurt goes deep. One contradiction often remarked on is the brave face that is so often a feature of the survivors.
Generally speaking, in these situations, people respond in a range of ways. We find that a number of people will come through reasonably well at a very early stage. The majority of people will encounter some difficulties, and a small number of people will encounter greater difficulties. The brave face may reflect people's awareness or feeling that the public out there are fed up listening to them, and they may have decided to switch off and not speak about their feelings. And this is a common experience indeed in, if we could call, ordinary bereavement, where people feel self-conscious about their feelings and don't want to talk about them at large.
You say a common occurrence. Are there parallels elsewhere we can draw on to apply to the trauma of Enniskillen?
We have benefited from the experiences of Bradford, Hungerford and Zeebrugge and places like that, where we have found that people respond in a whole range of ways, and in many cases those whom we most expect to be victims come through better, and those whom we traditionally may have regarded as being unscathed suffer greater emotional consequences.
It's a common supposition that those people who are nervous by nature or depressive by nature are not too adequate, that when they're visited by a tragedy or a bereavement, they're going to fall apart. Well, the truth is, and the reality is, the very, very opposite. When people who have pre-existing emotional symptoms are visited by some awful real event, for some reason, they seem to gather themselves, perhaps very often attributing their own private feelings which are caused by some sort of conflict in their own mind, but attributing that to the bone. So it's nonsense to say there's a predisposed nervous type person who will fall apart. The very opposite. They actually improve or hold themselves together. The second interesting thing about Enniskillen, at least when we looked at the 6-month stage, was that those people who were most physically injured did not show the most significant psychological symptoms. Now, why should that be? I looked at 5 particularly severely injured people, and they were, if you like, at the 6-month stage, the psychologically most healthy. I think the reason for it was this. The physically injured went into hospital, but those who were only psychologically injured went home. And the physically injured spent 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks in plaster of Paris in hospital with a lot of love and attention by the nurses. And I think being in hospital because you're physically injured seems to provide a buffer or a protective influence.
When Gordon Wilson received the Man of the Year award last week, he found himself once again in the glare of publicity. That public role, according to Jerry Burns, was important to his fellow survivors.
Gordon provided the base. He provided the base where many other constructive people were able to stand alongside him. And it was that really
and to get back
to normal living. If he hadn't been there, I'm not so sure what would have happened. But the fact that he stood there and others were able then to fall into line with him, I think that made all the difference in the world.
But that public exposure was at a price. It created enormous strains for Gordon Wilson.
Well, you talk about stress. I have had, of course, one's personal grief, which is still very near the surface, and one's personal injuries. The stress, I have to say it, is from folk like you. And it's obviously a whole new ball game for me, and one could find oneself, and sometimes did, in very deep water. But one likes to think one got the grace to come through it, and hopefully we will continue to do so. But the pressure's been there.
There was the conventional wisdom put out by the media at the time that this was in fact a forgiving community. Is this the force, the drive that led people to take that position?
I think so. People tried to make good out of the bad of Enniskillen. And the churches came forth, and we heard a lot about forgiveness and love and tolerance and support. It was an essential thing to do for the schools and the local community and so on. But when you sit down and talk to a few individuals, a lot of them didn't have those feelings. A lot of them felt bitter, especially the men. The women I found were more loving, forgiving, preached tolerance, support, love, etc., etc. A lot of the young men in private would tell you they don't feel forgiving. They feel bitter, they felt angry, they felt revengeful and wanted vengeance. And many of them complained to me that they felt it peculiar that to have these feelings was out of step with the rest of the community, where everybody else was preaching love and tolerance and so on. A lot of these guys had these feelings of anger and bitterness and felt they shouldn't be saying them because nobody else was saying them. But those feelings were there.
For David Couples, who lost 6 of his congregation that day, there was the responsibility of leadership and loneliness too.
There was, as you say, an element of loneliness in that the responsibility for many things finally rested with me. It really was very much a team effort that week. And also I could say that I am very close to the congregation and they are to me, and I was conscious not only that they were looking to me, but that they were supporting me in their prayers and thoughts also. So it was very much a question of mutual help.
And were you actively conscious of the strain that was implied by that relationship?
Not so much in the period when the funerals were going on. I can say honestly that I had a tremendous sense of inner peace and calm during all that period. But in the evening after the last funeral, which was on the Thursday, I had a period where I completely collapsed physically and emotionally, and had to just rest for a couple of hours and very much seek a shoulder to cry on.
Yes, that one there.
Noreen Hill, like many others in the town, faces the agony afresh each day. Her husband Ronnie, the headmaster of Enniskillen High School, was pulled from the rubble, just alive. Doctors told her several times he wouldn't see morning. He survived, to be trapped in a body which lies helpless on a hospital bed. Mrs. Hill isn't sure if her husband can even hear her, but she maintains a vigil at his bedside.
Medically, there's no hope for Ronnie. Ronnie is going to be, medically, he'll be the way he is now. And he could live 15, 20 years. He could live the rest of his natural life, whatever that would be. But also, he could die tomorrow. We just keep praying that there'll be a miracle and that Ronnie will get better. I mean, it is, if Ronnie gets better, it will be a miracle.
But you haven't been able to communicate with your husband since that day?
No, we can't communicate. Well, Ronnie just lies there. He doesn't move. He can hear us and he can feel, if we touch him, he can feel us touching. We talk to him. We tell him everything that goes on. And the staff, his school staff, come up and talk to him and tell him things that happen in the school. His vice principal comes up, and he was up with me this morning. The senior master was up with me this morning. And they tell him anything that's going on in the school.
Now, some people in the community have remarked that your situation is worse or indeed harder to cope with than those who have lost people in the explosion.
Well, I mean, again, it's hard for me to say that it is worse or it's not, because, I mean, I don't know what they go through. But I assume when they were told that their loved one was killed, they would have gone through exactly what I went through, but I have gone through it 5 times. But again, Ronnie is still there, and where there's life, there's always hope.
In your darkest moments, you must have had some thoughts about those people who carried out the bomb. What is your attitude to them?
I have no anger, I have no bitterness, and I have no hatred, because I feel that if I had had bitterness, anger or hatred, it would have burnt me up. So the Lord took that all away, because I had to have my strength had to go to contend with what I had to come through. So I needed the strength for that, and I couldn't afford to have any strength going on bitterness or hatred. So I never had any bitterness or hatred.
So you've tolerated